Welcome, everyone, to the webinar series that is based on the book, Our Warming Planet, Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. This is the third in the webinar series, and our speakers today are Faisal Rahman and Salim Haq and Pam Berry. The book is a very special book because it was created in honor, if we can go to the next one, next slide. The book was really this one good, because I want to share first about the editors. And the central person in the middle here is Martin Parry, who the book was motivated to honor his career as a research leader and co-chair of the IPCC. Martin's currently visiting professor at the Center for Environmental Policy at Imperial College London. It was very, very strongly engaged with the IPCC and very fundamentally really developing the field of climate change impacts and adaptation. Also, I want to introduce our co-editor, Manishka Demel, who is a senior staff associate at Columbia University's Climate School, based at the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in our group. She leads the portfolio on research on conservation impacts and adaptation for conservation and development, has participated in the Adaptation Gap Report of UNEP, and is an award-winning young scholar, early career researcher. Let me share a little bit more about the book, because it's a very new kind of book, which is in the next slide. I think we go to the topics. But before I tell you about the topics, we have to share that the books are not just ordinary. The topics here are not covered just by ordinary chapters. What they are the contributions by the authors are lectures of up-to-date material from the leading researchers in the field of impacts and adaptation. So there are the slides of the lectures, which are available with the book, and the book is available it is available in the print version, but also ebook, and the slides come in with however the book is transmitted. But what it does is the book covers these lectures cover the topics of methods and approaches to climate change impacts and adaptation, impacts on sectors. Then, of course, impacts are always place-based, so impacts on different regions and countries. And then finally, very much the links to policy and practice. And again, with thanks to all the authors for developing their lectures. As they said, they are leaders in their field. Many of them have been authors in the IPCC, and as Pam Berry today is an author from the biodiversity assessment as well. So thanks to all the authors, and this webinar series follows this trajectory. And we're now on our third webinar, and finishing up a bit on methods and approaches, and then launching in on the biodiversity part on impacts on sectors. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today is we're going to do, Manishka is going to lead a getting to know the audience set of polls. We always like to know who's here with participating. Then we are waiting. Let's see if Faisal has been able to come, possibly not yet. Faisal and Salim are leading the Gobeshona conference right now in Bangladesh, so they may be very busy. So there may be an update. We may be changing the schedule. But Pam Berry is here. We'll hear from her on impacts of climate change on biodiversity, the role of nature-based solutions. This is a major, major hot topic right now for countries all around the world to really motivate scaling up nature-based solutions. Then Manishka, or actually yes, Manishka will lead live Q&A, so be sure to pile on with lots of great questions in the Q&A. And then what we do is, if we ask our speakers and any other of the authors from the book to participate in a discussion, again, very much with questions from the audience on where do we go next on impacts and adaptation. So the book is capturing the state of the art, but now we have to always, research always goes forward. Jen Evans will then share related NASA educational resources, and then we'll do a wrap up. So that's our schedule for today. I think next is over to you, Manishka, to get to know the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. Welcome, everybody. We usually have people joining us from across the world, and that's the aim. The aim is to get these educational programs out to as many regions as possible. So let me launch the poll, and I'll leave it up for about 30 seconds. And please vote, and we can get to know where you're from. So I'm going to launch the first question. There'll be 3. So during the first webinar, which was the launch, we had participants from every region here, but it's very late in Oceania, so I don't think that we're going to have participants from that region. So we have 74% who have voted. Keep voting, and then I'll have. Great. Okay, I'm gonna stop now, and I'll share the result. So we have representation from most regions, not all, great. Welcome from all across the world. Okay, and we will launch to the next question, which is to understand a little bit about which sector you're from. So please go ahead. Once again, we have a pretty good cross-section and participants from a range of sectors, and fantastic. We actually have representation from all sectors today, which is very exciting. And we still have more people who can participate. So we are almost at 70% of participants. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. So let me share the result. We have all sectors represented, which is fantastic. Great. And then on to the final question, which is to understand a little bit more about your involvement in climate change work. So please go ahead and answer the questions. Once again, we have a range of involvements. This is great. We have, once again, almost 70%, over 70% that have participated. So I'll keep it open for a few more seconds, and then I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So we have, once again, a range of involvement in climate change work. So this is great. Okay, thank you, everyone. Really good to get to know you all through the poll. We would also like to get to know you individually. So please share your name, country, institution, role, whatever information you feel comfortable sharing, how you think this book might be useful for your work, and you can use the chat function for that. Thanks once again. And over to you, Cynthia.
Wonderful, thank you. Next slide, please. I'm going to now introduce Pam Berry, who will be our first speaker. So because we think that Faisal and Salim are completely tied up with hosting a major international conference, so that they are not able to participate. But we will reschedule with them, and also certainly all the lectures are recorded, and so there will be hearing from them about the important topic of community-based and which is now community-led adaptation, locally led adaptation. There's been an evolution there. But we will go directly to our wonderful colleague Pam Berry, who is a senior research fellow at the Environmental Change Unit, one place that Martin was one of the very early founding directors of at the University of Oxford. And Pam there she leads the Biodiversity, Climate Adaptation, and Ecosystems group. She was a coordinating lead author of the IPBES. Pam, you're going to have to remind us. I only know IPCC, but please remind us about the biodiversity assessment that you are a key member of. And has also been a contributing author to the European chapter of the IPCC. Her research, so critically important, is the interaction of climate change and biodiversity effects, and very much moving towards solutions and the use of nature as solutions. So with that, welcome to our Warming Planet webinar series, and over to you, Pam.
Thank you. So hopefully you can see my screen and you can hear me. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending which part of the world you're coming from. There are a number of complex global issues facing humans, and many of them are interrelated, thus making them particularly challenging. And two of those, which are high up the global environmental agenda, as Cynthia has alluded to, are climate change and biodiversity loss. But increasingly, they're being seen together. So what I want to do in this lecture is to examine the links between climate change and biodiversity loss, and to explore how nature could provide a role in addressing these two issues together, along with other societal challenges. And I want to argue very much for a more systemic approach to addressing global environmental problems.
Excuse me, Pam, could you speak a little bit closer to your microphone?
Certainly. Is that better? Is that better?
Much better. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Right. Right. I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that global temperatures are increasing, and that we need to think about how these projected temperature rises might impact on biodiversity and other systems in the future. But also, as Cynthia alluded to in her introduction, biodiversity loss is very much with us, as shown by this figure on the right from IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science and Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, which in future I'll refer to as IPBES. And what the global assessment of that shows is that there are a number of direct and indirect drivers that are currently very much impacting on ecosystems, on species, on ecosystem functions, leading to major declines in biodiversity. So we certainly have two challenges. As I said in my introduction, the two are very much related in my opinion, and they're very much being seen as two sides of the same coin. Here, a British pound. I didn't have an American currency to hand. Therefore, it's increasingly being recognised you cannot fully address climate change without addressing biodiversity loss, as biodiversity contributes both to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So biodiversity contributes to climate mitigation through storing and sequestering carbon, and it can contribute to adaptation, for example, in urban areas. Biodiversity, green space can help to reduce the urban heat island, and on coasts it can help to protect communities from sea level rise and floods. But similarly, you can't address biodiversity loss without addressing climate change, because climate change is already having significant impacts on species and habitats, and is continuing to do so at an accelerating rate, as the latest report from the IPCC showed when Working Group 2 was published about a month ago. So what I'm going to start with doing is looking at how climate change is observed as having an impact on biodiversity and biodiversity loss. And this slide shows a very large-scale literature review that was carried out on 94 ecological processes. And in this top diagram, it shows these processes divided into 4 categories and the extent to which they could be seen to be affected by climate change. So you can see that anything related to species distributions are all being affected noticeably by climate change. Similarly, ecosystem productivity, and probably where we have least evidence is impacts on organisms, particularly morphology, genetics, and to a lesser extent, their physiology. And if you look at the bottom of this diagram, it shows that of the processes looked at, 82% of them showed a definite impact of climate change. And this was seen more strongly in the terrestrial ecosystems, perhaps compared to the freshwater marine ecosystems. So climate change is very definitely impacting in an observable way on ecosystems and processes. And perhaps just another slide on this, which perhaps seems quite a complicated diagram, but what it does is to show the distribution of biomes. And if you look at these circles, they are showing where in the top half of the diagram, an ecosystem is being impacted and retracting due to climate change. And in the bottom half of the circle in the Northern Hemisphere, it's reversed in the Southern Hemisphere, just to confuse you, it shows the ecosystem that is expanding. So in this case of site 17, it's the alpine and tundra, in this case tundra, that's retreating, and temperate mixed forest that's increasing. So just 2 examples of the observed impacts of climate change. And looking to the future, there's plenty of modelling work that's been done to look at what climate change might mean in the future. So this is some massive modelling work that was done by Rachel Warren et al. On, I think, over 115,000 species, looking at how their climatically determined range might change under different levels of climate change, as shown by the x-axis. And the percentage of species on the y-axis losing at least half of their climatically determined range. And so you can see by these different graphs representing different taxa that climate change has a potential future impact across all taxa that a 1.5 degree world will have a much lower impact in terms of loss of suitable range, climate range, compared with 4.5, differed by a factor of about 8 to 10 for most taxonomic groups. But this slide also shows in the blue bars where if you take species realistic dispersal into account, movement polewards or upwards in altitude might enable a species to stay within its suitable climatic range. But even then, you can see there are still liable to be very large changes in terms of species and their ability to track climate space. So obviously interested perhaps in how this might play out geographically. And this modelling work, as shown on the previous slide, has been sort of re-evaluated and mapped for the IPCC assessment report. And once you can see that as projections of increase in temperature go up, so the percentage of projected biodiversity loss also increases, as shown by the increase in light purple and dark purple on the top slide, where you can see that large parts of South America, Southern Africa, Australia, and Northern and parts of Central Europe could see large decreases in species numbers. So moving on from species to have a look at potential impacts on ecosystems. This is using a different type of modeling, the dynamic global vegetation model, for those of you who are interested. And what this figure shows is ecosystems where there's more than 50% likelihood of a change in ecosystem type. And once again, and not surprisingly, it's the high latitudes, high altitudes that are liable to show changes. And just homing in a little bit, and I put this slide in because I rather suspected there might be a number of people interested from North America. This again is looking at potential ecosystem changes in North America. And what you can see here that under current climate, the dominant vegetation type is evergreen forests. But as you move into the future, then there could be up to about 48% reduction in the evergreen forest type as it becomes replaced by a mixed or a more deciduous forest type. And this is particularly true around the sort of Hudson Bay and northern Quebec. So there are plenty of projections of future climate change, which suggests there could be changes at all levels of biodiversity. But the question is, what should we do about it? There are plenty of opportunities to undertake mitigation, and I'll say more about that later. There's also plenty of opportunity to undertake adaptation to enable or to at least assist biodiversity to adapt to climate change. And a lot of the adaptation actions for climate change are actually the same as or just enhanced conservation actions if you're undertaking conservation to improve ecological status and condition of species. What I think is often neglected, and that's what I want to focus on, is the fact that mitigation and adaptation is occurring in all sectors. It's not just in the sort of biodiversity sector. And very often it's the actions that have been taken in these other sectors which impact on biodiversity and perhaps may represent a greater challenge for future adaptation, or they may represent an opportunity. And one of the things that I was involved in as part of an EU project was to do a semi-systematic literature review on this and to explore how adaptation actions in 6 different sectors represented by the columns could interact with each other. And here I've just picked up the slide on agricultural adaptation actions. So here you have a number of different actions that may be taken in order to adapt agriculture to climate change. And in these rows representing the intervention, you can see that they interact with other sectors. And what's quite interesting was that we found both with agriculture and with other sectors, very often the most interactions were with biodiversity and water. So if we're going to take adaptation in the biodiversity sphere forward, it's important that we also have a look and see what's going on in other sectors, because they may well be enhancing or detracting from the actions that we're trying to take. And it's quite possible by looking at the different interventions to have a look and actually try and rank the interventions according to how well they do actually mesh with each other. And in that sense, to have a look at how different adaptations interact with each other, and to try and pick out those which potentially are particularly effective, not just in terms of adaptation, but also in terms of mitigation as well. So if I just pick out 1 or 2 from this slide, you can see that if you look at something like urban green infrastructure, it's actually a low regret action, because it will improve, as I said earlier, the urban heat island. Also, if you're putting more green into the urban area, you'll be storing more carbon in the ecosystem. But also it can produce other multiple benefits, such as dealing with sort of flash flooding in urban areas, as well as providing more habitat for species. And similarly, if you look at something like flood defences, here I'm thinking very much of sort of hard flood defences, they're actually not very flexible. And while they may not particularly interact much with other sectors, they nevertheless are not contributing very much to adaptation as far as biodiversity is concerned. So that's just a quick look at some of the ways in which biodiversity and other sectors can really interact with each other, both over the issue of climate adaptation and of climate mitigation. So much for the climate side of the coin. What I want to do now is to think about how biodiversity interacts with the climate change issue. And what I want to focus on is the most obvious thing, is the role of biodiversity and land use in the global carbon budget. So what you see here on this slide is above the middle line marked sort of 0 is the sources of emission of carbon dioxide. And here you can see that the major emissions now are from fossil fuels and industry, as shown by the grey wedge. There are also emissions from land use change, but they're much lower. So probably about 18% from land use change and 82% from fossil fuel emissions. But if you look below the line, it shows you where the sinks or stores of carbon dioxide are. Now, about 48% of carbon dioxide emitted actually goes into the atmosphere and is reflected partially in the increase in greenhouse gases. But actually about 30% of emissions are stored on land, particularly in natural and semi-natural habitats, but also obviously in more managed forests. And the rest is stored in the ocean. So by maintaining biodiversity or enhancing biodiversity storage, biodiversity has a major role to play in climate mitigation. So how can we start to bring all these things together? As I said at the beginning, there's a real interest in the role of nature in trying to address the issue of climate change. And obviously, biodiversity has an almighty part to play in addressing biodiversity loss. And what we're seeing now is arguments for what are called nature-based solutions. Now, nature-based solutions have various definitions, and what I've got on this slide is the different definition from the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and the sort of graphic that they produced to go with it. And essentially what's been argued for is that if you're using solutions to challenges based on nature through protecting, managing, or restoring nature, you can actually address a range of societal challenges, such as climate change, agriculture, water, hazards, health, and just well-being associated with interactions with nature. But also, as the end of the definition is showing, not only do you address these societal challenges, they also enhance human well-being in its widest sense, and they must be positive for biodiversity. So what could nature-based solutions do for climate change? Wiscombe et al. In this figure here argue that actually what they call natural climate solutions, what I would argue are nature-based solutions for climate change, could actually produce 37% of the mitigation that we need to have a 2/3 chance of keeping the Paris Agreement. And this is up to 2030. And probably they provide about 20% of the mitigation needed up to 2050. They're obviously not the whole part of the solution, because as the top part of the diagram shows, we're also going to need clean energy, and I would argue changes in demand for energy. But nevertheless, nature-based solutions have quite a potential for climate mitigation, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And the various actions that they suggest that could provide such mitigation listed down the left-hand side of the diagram, and the right-hand side shows their mitigation potential. And not surprisingly, it's those related to forestry which have the greatest mitigation potential. But I think the important thing to realize here is that avoided forest conversion or avoided peat impacts or avoided coastal impacts have high mitigation potential, relatively speaking. And these are totally consistent with maintaining and possibly enhancing or restoring biodiversity. And then as these bars, coloured bars show against each action, these different climate mitigation pathways can also provide other benefits, and thus they can be considered as real nature-based solutions for climate change. But not surprisingly, as I showed earlier, there are a number of benefits, but also a number of trade-offs or unintended consequences that may be achieved by these actions. So if you take something like wetland and coastal habitat creation or recreation, while certainly you may get the climate adaptation benefits of water storage, decreased flood risk, and increased habitats for species, nevertheless, there is always a trade-off with other land uses, and also the ponded water may lead to the proliferation of these vectors. Similarly, on the climate change mitigation side, while you get increased carbon sequestration, you may get more emissions of other greenhouse gases. So, trying to make the situation even more complex, this slide shows a number of responses based on land management to the issue of climate change, and again shows a number of different actions that could be taken, but also assesses not only how they might contribute to adaptation and mitigation, but also to other global issues like desertification and land degradation and food security. But once again, one can follow similar actions like reduced deforestation and forest degradation and see how they can actually achieve multiple objectives, because forests are by nature multifunctional. And this is where I think things are really exciting, that we can possibly start to see a way forward in addressing climate change and biodiversity loss and other global challenges together. And so what I would argue is what we need is a much more systemic approach to global issues. And this socio-ecological model for peatland restoration, a key nature-based solution, shows exactly how complex it is once you bring in all the pressures which come from human demands, other drivers related to climate change, once you look at the whole social system and the policy framework. But hopefully you'll agree that actually this, while challenging, does start to represent something that's perhaps closer to the real world and might enable us to find a more holistic way forward. It's obviously not going to be without its challenges, because all this is fine in theory, but nature-based solutions and other opportunities to bring together biodiversity and climate change are often very site-specific and context-specific. So it's challenging to make sure that they are appropriately designed and implemented. It's going to require integration of policies to make sure that they're working together and that regulations or laws are working together in a coherent fashion. It's going to require cross-sectoral working. It's going to require stakeholders working together. And not surprisingly, it needs to be better financed. So yes, there are challenges going forward. But for me, as the eternal optimist, I think there is some light on the horizon. So what I would like to do is to argue, and hopefully I have argued, albeit incredibly briefly, you have to read more in the book, that it is possible to address climate change and biodiversity loss together. But very often you can address more than that if you take a more systematic approach, perhaps using nature-based solutions, because they do provide this more integrated view of the world and enable us to perhaps look to a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Thank you very much. It's very wonderful for you to provide this tour d'horizon on this integrated facets. That I love the two sides of the pound coin from Britain, from the UK. Manishka's, we have at least one question for you directly following your lecture, and Manishka is going to lead that. Also, participants, any questions for Pam directly, please put into the Q&A.
Great, thank you. We actually have 3 questions, so I guess I'll have to ask my question another time, Pam. So let's go with what the participants have. So first is from Alan. He says, Pam, is there any work on using climate intervention to reduce global warming impacts on biodiversity? I think you said this, but you know, please go ahead and.
Right. I mean, it depends what you mean by climate intervention. I mean, I would argue anything that involves climate mitigation would help to reduce global warming impacts on biodiversity. The problem is doing enough fast enough would be my short answer to that one.
Thanks, Pam.
I can see the one or two others. Then if you want me to answer
we have 2 more. Wonderful slides, and I applaud you for putting references in them. Are nature-based solutions being implemented with sensitivity to the existing organisms in the region? For example, organisms in the Amazon have adapted to tropical forests, so any use of nature-based solutions is best engineered with this in mind to maintain those organisms.
Well, I would argue that they have to be implemented with sensitivity to existing organisms in the region, because by definition, they have to provide benefits to biodiversity. And it's essentially talking about what's there and working with what's there, while I would argue also making sure you have an eye to the future and that whatever solution that you put in place is climate resilient. I think where you get the insensitivity and where there's been quite a lot of controversy around some of the slides that I showed from Griscom et al. And some of the discussions there's been in the scientific literature is that people have been arguing that monoculture plantations are a nature-based solution because they store carbon and they increase biomass. But certainly those from the nature-based solutions community and from an ecological community would argue that they're not nature-based solutions because they do not take the biodiversity into account, and they certainly do not enhance biodiversity and are most likely to degrade it.
Thank you, Pam. We have a couple of other questions as well. So Minnie says, on nature-based solutions, especially around reforestation, afforestation, how should we think about account for potential loss to wildfire? The Lion's Head wildfire in Oregon destroyed a large chunk of the forest carbon offset projects that were in CA's carbon market. They had a buffer pool insurance mechanism in that case, but future losses may exceed that buffer. Thanks.
Yes, that's a very good point. and certainly wildfires are projected to increase in many parts of the world as areas get hotter and drier. And I think if that's the case, then it's about making sure things are climate resilient. And so it's thinking about the fact that trees are going to be there for decades. And therefore you need to make sure that they're planted and managed in such a way that as far as possible, they are not as susceptible to wildfires. Though coming from a country which really doesn't have wildfires, I appreciate that I don't sort of understand fully the full impact that wildfires can have. But I think the climate resilience side of nature-based solutions is sometimes sort of overlooked. And it's certainly something that I'm always talking about and trying to push for. And I can see that Alan has kindly said that climate intervention is geoengineering, thus enlightening me perhaps a bit further what he meant by that. I certainly think there is sort of geoengineering proposed, but at the moment I'm very skeptical of how much it can achieve. And certainly I think a lot of the things that I've read about have generally been negative on biodiversity, but I'm not an expert in that area.
Thanks, Pam. And I think we can go with one more question, but if, we do have a few more minutes for questions. If people have others, please type into the Q&A box. We have a question from Imani. What nature-based strategies have the most support currently from corporations that cause these problems?
Oof. Yes, I have to think about that question. I mean, I think the sort of nature-based strategies that are getting the most support at the moment are around those that sort of sequester carbon. So ones around reforestation. Certainly that's sort of true in the UK, partly because there's government funding for reforestation. It's being pushed quite hard as part of our net zero commitment. And there are opportunities, obviously, for markets in carbon. So I think that's the one that's received most attention here. I'm not so certain on a global perspective, and I don't know if anybody else, Manishka or anybody else, whether you have any views of what's been pushed or be working well in the US?
I'm not entirely sure about the US, but my general sense is that reforestation seems to be the main mechanism. But, I'm not entirely sure about corporates, but that's kind of generally the sense I'm getting. Any
Right.
of the other panelists want to add to that? We can move on to the next question, and that's from Patricia. What is your opinion about introducing plants from nearby areas that are affected by climate change in order to provide for species that are forced to migrate to habitat to new areas which are similar to temperature regimes?
So if I understand that question, it's about moving species to their new sort of climatically suitable area.
I think you're right, Pam. Yes, I think
so
that.
Hopefully, I would see that as a sort of last resort. I think I would go for other adaptation strategies as much as possible, such as increasing connectivity, ensuring there's relevant habitat available, or if necessary, making sure that the appropriate sort of food web structure is there. I always tend to think in plant terms, reflecting my background, but I recognize there are animals as well. But also I recognize that there are species that, because of their inherent characteristics, are unable to move easily from one area to another, because of dispersal characteristics, the need for specialized conditions. And I think then translocation may be necessary. But I often end lectures to students when I'm talking about climate change and biodiversity with a misquote from Shakespeare, which is to intervene or not to intervene. That is the question. And that is one which I'm beginning now to think about. Perhaps we should let nature take its course as much as possible. And I am probably advocating less intervention than I would have done when I first started in the climate change field about 30 years ago. But maybe I'm just getting lazy in my old age.
Thank you, Pam. Thanks so much. We had a lot of questions. I think these are most questions we've had after a lecture. So thank you, everyone. And let's move on to the next lecture. So I'll let Cynthia do the introductions.
Yes.